There's a bit on your blog when you talk about nationalism and archaeology, and co-opting history for political and ideological means. I mean, that was really interesting about the old acquaintance cairn on the borders, I guess if I have a question, it would be like, how do you feel that, sort of specifically a monuments or objects or ideas from prehistory being co-opted for political and ideological means?
They've been co-opted. I mean, there's a really long history of that. I mean, the Nazis had archaeologists who were paid to go out and find evidence for Germanic peoples around the world. That was one of the things that they were doing around Africa and in Asia and so on. So there are quite extreme examples of that. But I think that what's been interesting for me is just trying to find examples of ancient history and prehistory that have been used within current political debates, and one of and in particular that border zone is something that's very contentious, and so people look to that area as somewhere that where they can try and find legitimacy or illegitimacy for instance the existence of a border. So Hadrian's Wall is constantly brought up on both sides of the independence debate. Both sides use this wall, which isn't even on the border. It's not even. It's like 50 miles into England or something. It was never a border as we understand a modern border. So again, it gives us. It was actually just a way of the Romans controlling movement to collect taxes, just to kind of keep an eye on things. And it was never a kind of a firm land boundary. It wasn't like the edge of Rome or the Roman Empire as such. It was their borders are much more fluid and flexible. So it's a good example of an ancient concept that doesn't really quite work with our modern concepts. But all we can think about are borders and about countries and flags and identities and stuff like that. So these things get used quite loosely and lazily by everyone on every side of the argument. They will re-establish Hadrian's Wall. The English want Hadrian. It's all this kind of stuff, and it just misuses the past because Hadrian's Wall has got no relevance whatsoever to the modern historical boundaries of Scotland and England. And that border, if you look back at the history of that border has moved all over the place constantly and has been very flexible and fluid and has never been that fixed. And so you can't use anything about that to either support or argue against Scottish independence. It's just no relevance to that discussion whatsoever. So those kind of things are used quite lazily. And the old acquaintance cairn is a particularly weird example because it was an attempt to try and the attempt. Actually, what was interesting for me was it was actually about communal labour and endeavour. That was really the idea behind it. They chose for no apparent reason. They chose a Bronze Age type of cairn that's only found in Inverness, which I can't understand, because that doesn't make any sense to what they were trying to do. But anyway, they had this monument, but the idea was to get people to come together from everywhere in Britain to contribute labour and to bring stones with them to create the monument. So the monument was basically a microcosm of Britain united, I suppose, of everyone's labour and the materiality of the island being brought to one place, and of the labour of everyone being brought to one place. And so there's a kind of powerful political argument behind that. But what's interesting is that those ideas are ones that prehistorians have used to discuss the construction of prehistoric monuments. So we know, for instance, that the Rings of Brodgar and Orkney is constructed of stones from a number of different quarry sources. We know that Stonehenge is constructed from stones from a range of different sources as well in South Wales. So there's this idea that monuments are a conglomeration of the materials of the land that are brought together, and often that involves large-scale communal labour. But that was not done in prehistory to reinforce the identity of a country. It might not even have been about tribal identity. It might have been something completely different from that. So again, you've got an idea that basically borrows from prehistoric archaeology, and is kind of notionally uses archaeological evidence, and then kind of sets up this political statement, which is actually really got nothing to do with the reality of prehistory, or indeed make any logical sense in terms of the archaeology. So I just think people should be cautious about, and I'm not saying it's dangerous, because it's fine. I've been there before, and I think that when I visited, I was quite interested. There was there was some Ulster stuff there, and there was obviously, and with some of the comments you read about it, there's obviously people were thinking about Northern Ireland, and there was various different, tensions that were coming out through that, and there's lots of images of Union Jacks on the monument and stuff, and so it's a source of tension. But I'm not saying it's like Nazi Germany. I mean, it's not the same kind of thing. But there's a kind of lazy use of archaeology which offers a sense of legitimacy for political arguments. And as far as I know, Rory Stewart, who's the MP who cooked up the idea, also at the time was trying to organise this kind of hands across the border thing, where he wanted a line of people, mimicking Hadrian's Wall, going across the border, holding all the way along the border between Scotland and holding hands. And again, it's a sense of just, of kind of trying to give a sense that there's some kind of historical or prehistoric legitimacy to these kind of arguments, and it's what he's trying to do is in some ways is quite subtle, and I don't think that every visitor is necessarily going to pick up on the fact that it's about communal labour, it's about materiality. These people will say, "Oh, it's a prehistoric monument," and he talks about it as being a prehistoric monument of the type that you find in, there are cairns all over the north of England and the south of Scotland, and suggesting that in prehistory there was no border in prehistory, so why should there be now? And I think these ideas are all just misguided because it's got no relevance. There's nothing that happened in prehistory that has any relevance whatsoever to modern political or cultural identity. As far as I'm concerned, there was no countries, there was no borders as we understand them. Society was organised totally different. Symbols meant different things. Identity was played out in a whole range of different other ways. None of that is relevant. So that's what troubles me about it, is that it's being used in ways that are it shouldn't be. They've no place in the discussion. And if you look at and they're now kind of a bit of a spent force, but the BNP, when they were kind of at the highest peak about a decade ago, their manifesto explicitly said, that the British people, the indigenous British people, are the people who built Stonehenge, and ever since then, British culture has been watered down by immigrants and by people, invaders, and so that's that kind of thing. And so it's not very much of a step from using prehistory in a kind of a lazy, airy-fairy way in political modern discourse to actually coming to a point where you're saying things which are becoming deeply offensive and troubling, and are actually willfully exploiting a set of standing stones for extreme right-wing political ends. So it could be a slippery slope, and it troubles me a bit. So I'm trying to kind of keep an eye on instances of that kind of thing happening through the whole Brexit process and the next Scottish referendum, and there's a few historians looking out for that kind of thing as well. There's a few hashtags that are being used just to try and kind of collect together evidence of when there's just ludicrous statements being made by politicians which make claims that are related to supposed unity or disunity 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or talk about invasions and immigrations and stuff like that, as if, and it happens on both sides of the debate, because some archaeologists will say, oh well, archaeology is a great indicator of the fact that in prehistory there was all these immigrants came and everything was fine and everyone was happy, therefore, what's wrong with immigration? But it's the same, just because I'm more sympathetic to that side of the political spectrum doesn't mean I'm still not going to say, but that's not relevant. That's got nothing to do with how we view the world today, because immigration in 2000 BC is not immigration in 2000 AD. It's a totally different phenomena. It's got totally different motivations and drivers. It's got different dynamics. We've got no idea whatsoever about how people interacted. We don't know whether it was 10 people or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people that moved. None of these things we understand. And actually, most processes of population movement in prehistory are viewed through the lens of today. So therefore, we use these words like immigration, colonisation, which are these modern concepts to try and understand the prehistoric phenomena. So in fact, all we're doing is we're reflecting our society back onto prehistory, and then we're then taking that reflection and then reflecting it back onto our culture again. But it's actually, the prehistory is almost incidental. It's just a means to an end. So I think that it goes back to the issues of the words we use to express things, which are probably not even relevant to what happened in prehistory. That was a long-winded answer.
No. Yeah, I guess it's using history or historical narratives as a justification for things. But that's quite interesting because there's obviously a balance there between the personal interpretation and then it used in a divisive manner. I guess that's sort of like basis of ideological means, isn't it? Like I don't know what I'm sort of trying to say. Is like I guess there's a fine line between those two things, isn't there? I mean, whereas you might want to look back. You saying like it's stupid to reason for the ideas of immigration from looking back at historical immigration.
Well, I think historicals maybe the closer you get to now, then the easier it is to try and draw parallels and arguments. I think because you can start to look at 20th century immigration, things that happened 100 years ago, and you can start to think, well, okay, how does that marry up with what we did now? And you can maybe look at medieval processes as well. I think it's when you start to get back to prehistory, then it really becomes untethered because we've got no real sense of what these population movements were like, and what the dynamic was. And we don't know whether that dynamic. We don't even know, for instance, whether it was violent or consensual. We don't know whether Celts ended up across all of Europe because they were cutting people's heads off, and they basically were dominant, and they were a dominant military force, or were they a cultural force for good? We don't even know that kind of thing. So if we don't understand what was happening in prehistory, then it's very difficult for us to apply it to modern arguments. But historical stuff can be different. I mean, there's a well-established archaeology of colonialism and things like that, which looks at historical examples, and there are maybe lessons to learn. Because the other thing I don't want to give the impression is that I'm saying that the past is irrelevant to modern society. The past is still meaningful for a whole range of different reasons. We've talked about a lot of those already. But what prehistory is not going to do is it's not going to help us in modern political discourse and dialogues and discussions. But it's still important for us to understand and know about the past and enjoy it and explore it and think about how we can use information about the past to help us today and in the future. So that's all good. But I think that the political exploitation of symbols and materials and objects and monuments is really unhelpful. Maybe
it's politically it's easier for people to exploit prehistory in that way because a lot of it is based on these sort of fictions and interpretations. I guess there's a balance of ethics there, though, with it, like a responsibility.
Yes. Yeah, I think so, and I think there's a responsibility of archaeologists to be involved in these discussions and debates, and to intervene when there's something problematic is happening, or when there's something going on where you think, well, that's not right, that's not relevant. So I think archaeologists have to be socially engaged and politically engaged, and I think since the 1980s it's been recognised archaeology is a highly political subject, highly political discipline. But again, often academics see themselves as being one step removed from these processes, and maybe we need to intervene a bit more, rather than so when there's a newspaper that has a headline about Hadrian's Wall and Scottish nationalism, then maybe it's time archaeologists write letters into the paper the next day and say, this is ludicrous, and these are the reasons why we think this is ludicrous, because so I think archaeologists probably don't really involve themselves in these discussions very much. So it's interesting when I wrote about the Orkney programme that I got a lot of responses that read into that programme political narratives, because Neil Oliver was a no voter in the referendum, and BBC Scotland is viewed by a lot of people as having political biases, and so therefore that's put together by a lot of viewers of a kind of an SNP persuasion that the programme is actually nothing more than kind of propaganda, that Britain was always unified throughout the whole since prehistory. And I don't think that's actually what the programme was saying at all. But that narrative was read into it by people. So again, there's a kind of so prehistory is used by people as a political football, even when it's not being used in that way, and it's easy for people just to start seeing all sorts of stuff into it. And it's interesting that also comes down to the politics of the guy who narrates or broadcasts the programme or writes it, and the fact that people would actually think that Neil Oliver is imbuing his vision of the Neolithic with his his political personal beliefs. Is he? I don't know. I wouldn't imagine so. But these things are perceptions that are out there which are interesting as well.
Has there been any big cases of archaeologists with strong political views.
There's nothing that's really been. There are archaeologists who are Marxists, who are well-known Marxists, and that Gordon Childs, who was a leading archaeologist, was a Marxist, and that definitely his whole understanding of the origins of farming, the start of the Neolithic, was that it was a revolutionary process. So he understood that through a Marxist perspective. In the late 1980s, there was a lot of Marxist and neo-Marxist archaeologists that set the agenda with modern archaeological thinking and theory. But then one of the great figures of modern archaeology, Colin Renfrew, is a Tory peer in the House of Lords. So he's a rare right winger. There's not many right wingers in archaeology, but there's not. So I think that the people's political persuasion definitely guides the way they think about the past, but whether you can really, if usually not necessarily for sinister ends, it's just more like it's part of a kind of interpretive toolkit, and it's just a way of viewing the world, so a lot of modern archaeological thinking is based on a lot of hard left thought from the 80s. But then a lot that kind of stuff coming into archaeology opened up a lot of gender archaeology and changing the way we thought about a lot of things in the past. So there's these kind of political movements have been really important in archaeology. So it's not necessary. I don't think archaeology should try and pretend they've not got political beliefs. But if something is highly political, then you have to be explicit about where they're coming from. And it's quite easy to tell usually, or archaeologists are quite honest about where they're coming from. But I know there was an archaeologist, I can't remember his name, working in Ireland in the 1930s, who spent a lot of his time trying to prove that prehistoric tombs in Northern Ireland were different from those in Ireland, to try and argue that this border was one that was inherently prehistoric in its origins, and he was a professor of Irish archaeology in the 30s or something like that. So I think there was a lot of that kind of stuff about back then. It was quite a febrile atmosphere, but nowadays that isn't quite so prevalent. But there's a school of archaeologists. One of the kind of hot topic is the origins of the Scots and the connections with Ulster. And one of my colleagues, Ewan Campbell, has argued that there was never any migration of Scots into Ireland in the first millennium AD, but rather there was a shared culture between bits of Northern Ireland, between Argyll and southwest Scotland, and that it was just people who just moved across the North Sea quite freely back and forth. And that theory met with huge amounts of opposition from archaeologists, some based in Ulster, who said that this was basically trying to disentangle the kind of connections between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and so they saw it as being a very political narrative. So there are still some areas of prehistory and of early medieval history where they're highly political, and people's modern politics and modern religious beliefs really colour the way they argue about things. So it still does happen, even within the academic community.
Yeah. So I guess as an archaeologist, you not only study your area of interest, but you also have to study the history of archaeology as well. Archaeology has its own history.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Which is quite interesting, and obviously, like you're saying, a lot of that's political.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of it's is rooted within social and cultural context. So, in the 19th century, archaeologists were antiquarians. They were like Victorian gentlemen. They were interested in measuring skull shapes and all that kind of stuff. The same sort of thing anthropologists were doing. There was a bit of Darwinism as well there. First half of the 20th century, archaeologists were essentially historians, and they believed in population movements causing social change, because that's what historians saw as all the driver of all change in the past, from Roman invasions, Norman invasions, all that kind of stuff. In the 1950s and 60s, with scientific turn in society, the invention of things like radiocarbon dating through nuclear technology, archaeology became highly scientific and specialised discipline, and adopted all of the trappings of science and the ways of thinking and theorising about the past, and models and hypothesis testing. The 70s, then there was a kind of a bit more social theory came in. Computers were more immersed in archaeology, and people started doing computer modelling and statistics and stuff like that. And then in the 80s, everyone became postmodern, and suddenly sociologists and anthropologists and philosophers were being used in archaeology, and did a kind of postmodern turn happened. And now it's all like a kind of anything goes mixture of everything. So archaeology since its kind of origins, in the mid to late 19th century, has always been a reflection of the kind of the wider trends within society and culture, and has always been slightly behind other disciplines. So when stuff happens in archaeology, it probably happened in geography 25 years ago. So it's a kind of slightly weird time lag we've got as well. So the history of the discipline is something that we teach a lot to the students, just to try and understand the way that where we are just now. We've got quite a complicated series of philosophical and artistic sensibilities, which are also balanced up by a lot of hard science. So it's quite a complicated discipline, with people who view themselves across a broad spectrum. Some people who are purely scientists, some people who are social scientists, and kind of everything in between. So it's quite a complicated discipline.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about like sort of ideas about the Anthropocene, and because I was interested in how, like you said right at the beginning, how like Neolithic cultures or society was the first to sort of dramatically change the landscape and use the landscape for their own means and purposes, through agriculture, economics, and well, religion or sort of ceremonial.
Yeah, religion is a good way to describe it. Yeah, definitely.
Just sort of, I wanted to talk to you about how you relate that to now. How we've definitely irrevocably put our impact on this planet through our own actions.
Yes.
And in a way, was that started in
it's a process that started in prehistory. I mean, as soon as humans wanted to control nature, they wanted to regularise sources of food, for instance. Then they started to cut down trees, burn trees. So the major deforestation in Britain, for instance, happened in prehistory. And actually the country's been reforested to an extent since then. So there's a kind of sense just now that what we are doing is actually terrible, and that that we are destroying the planet in a way that hasn't been done before, and that's true to an extent. But humans have always monkeyed about with the environment in the world and in different ways, and one of the, to an extent, for instance, at the sort of around just before 1000 BC, humans had buggered up the upland landscape to an extent through over farming and through bad farming practice, that it was impossible for them to farm and live in the upper reaches of the environment anymore. And that then set in chain processes of peat formation, which is still something which is an extensive legacy across the whole of Britain. And a lot of that was just because people were overworking the environment, and so this is in prehistory this was happening, and they were exploiting resources in an unsustainable way. So although you can imagine, there are elements of prehistoric society were quite sustainable, especially when hunter-gatherer communities, who tended to be quite good at balancing needs with the society because population levels were so low. As populations continued to grow and new food sources were developed, which were much more exploitative and much more controlled and manipulated by people, then things became less and less sustainable. So I think that although of course what we're doing now is extreme in many different ways in terms of like fossil fuels and changing the whole environment, but humans have always been adept at changing things, and so almost every tree in Britain was kind of got rid of and cut down over a couple of thousand years to allow people to farm and to create bigger population bases and things like that. So I don't think we should necessarily look back on prehistory as a utopia where people were at one with nature and were living sustainable, balanced lifestyles. They were probably living organic lifestyles, definitely, but they were no angels in terms of making major changes that they didn't have a clue about the consequences. Whereas at least they had that excuse. Whereas we don't have the excuse because we know the consequences of our actions, but they still seem to happen, which is different. And also, we now do things on a completely different scale. Like urbanisation although it's been around for a long time, is nothing in the past has been matched up to the scale of what's happening now. And so I think that one of the lessons we can learn from prehistory is that humans have always changed and manipulated the landscape, and things have always been subject to change. We don't have any stasis really. So, and whether that's not of any great kind of relief to us to know that, but it's nothing new that we change the world around us. Well, I think that the past, what we think what the remnants of the past that still survive in our understandings of the past are relevant going into the future, because I think that we can learn a lot from the understanding the long-term nature of change and processes within the landscape. I think that people can kind of be amazed and inspired by the kind of concepts of things like deep time, where they can see that prehistoric stuff is happening in the same place that they're living thousands of years before. And I think I was talking to a colleague yesterday about this idea of future prehistories, the idea of where we can actually use prehistory almost as a kind of a shock therapy to get people to think afresh about where they live and about the way they live their lives and about where they're going into the future. And one of the great ways of doing that is that the idea of actually exposing people to the kind of the deep time of where they've been living, and to think about, in a sense, it's not just about the here and now, it's about, things happened thousands of years ago here, and that kind of can often make people think afresh about where they live and can maybe add a different value, and it's something that we've been exploring, but thinking about how you can use prehistoric ideas, tools, structures, buildings in ways that will be beneficial to society going forward. And some of that might be to think about more sustainable lifestyles. It might be to think about how to cope or deal with climate change in the future. It might be to think about how we design places to live that are more in tune with the natural world. And there's a whole range of different ways that archaeologists could potentially engage with the processes like urbanisation and through the stuff that we know about the past. So, but very few archaeologists engage with that element of archaeology, the future element of archaeology. There's been a few attempts to try and do things. I mean, a few years ago, Mike Shanks, who's an archaeologist who's based in California, worked with Chrysler to develop a car that was kind of based on the way that humans interact with material culture. And so they did a study where they looked at the way people interacted with bits of cars and other bits of material culture in their life, and they kind of designed a car that was based on archaeological premises. And to be honest with you, it didn't seem to. The end product was just basically a car where they had a touchscreen thing, and this was about 10 years ago. So I guess these are all commonplace now. Cars with screens and stuff like that, where you can press a button and your heating goes on at home and things like that. But they were trying to say that there's various different tactile things about the way that people interact with the world around them, which is an archaeological sensibility, if you like, about human material culture interactions, help design a future car, And it was a bit gimmicky, and I think actually, Chrysler just used it as a marketing device. But the very few archaeologists think about how the stuff we know about traditional skills and so on could resonate in the future. And actually, this feeds into one of your interests, I think, was yesterday. There was also a bit of chat about more apocalyptic scenarios in the future. And actually, there's a lot of fictional accounts of dystopian futures where people have regressed to prehistory because something's happened, like a disaster of some kind, or nuclear war or something, and then everything that we rely on now, technology-wise, is gone, and people have to go back to making fire with bits of stone, and they have to build tents out of animal skins, and they have to hunt and all that kind of stuff. And actually, there's a kind of the fiction suggests there's a kind of a level with which humanity will return to when it all goes wrong, and that level is prehistory. Whether it's usually the Iron Age, like books like Ridley Walker, which kind of create this Iron Age world in East Anglia where there's a Punch and Judy god or something like that, which is some kind of throwback to pre-apocalyptic society. But there's a sense that actually prehistory is like a baseline upon which everything else is built. But at any time, something could happen like that would suddenly mean we'd all have to regress back to prehistory again. And maybe actually there are certain skills and things that we can take forward that maybe it's useful that people know how to do. It's pretty useful that people know how to build with wood, that people know how to have survival skills, that people know how to hunt with bows and arrows, not guns. Those kind of things. It is actually useful to have people who can do that kind of stuff. And if the worst were to happen and there was some kind of disaster, those are the people who would float to the top of the pile, the people with the prehistoric survival skills, and the people who could do those kind of traditional crafts are actually the ones who might be the ones who come out best in that kind of scenario. So there's different ways you could actually model futures where prehistoric knowledge and information actually might become strangely quite valued and important and it might actually be that not prehistorians, because prehistorians can't do any of this stuff, but people who make prehistoric pots, people who make stone axes, those might be the social leaders in 100 years' time, because they've got those skills ready formed, and they can make that stuff, and they suddenly become kings, so you could see how society could turn on its head, and suddenly those skills will be the ones that are valued, and not just the preserve of eccentrics.
Although we don't trust experts anymore. So.
No, that's true. No. But maybe when everything else is gone and there's nothing left, then that's all we have.
Then the trust in experts will come back again.
Yeah, suddenly it'll be. Yeah.
Well, that's quite interesting because there is an American culture of preppers, isn't there? That's sort of prepping for apocalypse. But
yeah, that's true.
I mean, this sort of 21st century is very much like a century of nostalgia and looking back. I mean, most culture is now being rehashed from a few years back. So,
yeah.
I mean, I've sort of got this idea that we're just going to regress and regress and regress,
it's
naturally anyway.
Yeah.
So
it's happening. I mean, you think all these the paleo diet, which is like basically meant to be a Paleolithic diet, clean living, raw food. Look, there's a huge rise in crafts. People interested in making pottery, in textiles and knitting and all those kind of things. And these are all skills that are ancient skills in their origin, and that are the kind of things that were almost forgotten. And when I was younger, the only people you ever saw knitting were old people, and now loads of people knit. It's very common. So and I think it was only weird eccentrics who did pottery, but now the pottery classes are thriving. There's loads of kind of opportunities to do that kind of thing. So I think that a lot of these skills, even though they're not necessarily viewed as being prehistoric, are actually becoming more significant and important again. And I don't know whether that is a response to, in the same way as sales of vinyl are now higher than they've been for decades. Is it some kind of response or kickback to the digital society and modern living and the kind of the high tech age that we live in, that people are now looking for something simpler, something different, and that part of that again is a regression to prehistoric skills and techniques, which is quite an interesting process. So, but whether that'll how far that'll play itself out, I don't know.
But then again, it is very. I mean, people that are sort of doing that fairly affluent,
yes,
can afford.
Yeah, exactly.
They can afford to do it, so there's a sort of paradox there, and
that is definitely
you have to be well enough off to to sort of indulge in a culture of not plenty.
Yeah,
you're
right.
To have plenty to not have plenty.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the way these things often go, and I think that that's in the same way as the heritage stuff is more often than not of more interest to people from certain socio-economic backgrounds. I think that's probably the same kind of thing. Actually, there's a kind of middle class that follows fashions and trends and likes doing these kind of weird things and eccentric things, and there's an element of that to that. So it's whether that will become a broader trend within society, or whether other people are just too worried about finding where the next nearest food bank is to care about all that kind of stuff. I don't know. But then people making their own clothes, growing their own food. Those are things that are not necessarily the preserve of people with money, and it could well be that those kind of processes are ones that are more broadly applicable, because they're cheap and easy to do, and but they're very fundamental as well.
And in that sense, talking about the Sight Hill Stone Circle, that's quite interesting. In that in your blog it said it didn't survive a generation.
No, it didn't. No.
And also you say what I quite liked what you'd written. It says the part looked terrible, like a hungover clown.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, yeah. It was a horrible. Well, it was a horrible park because the park was built on reclaimed industrial land, which actually when I kind of walked it, I realised was just full of all sorts of bits of rubbish, including like fragments of gravestones and labels from butchers' counters, displays, and bits of glass and weird pipes and tubes. It was like a kind of Ballardian nightmare of weird stuff that was coming out the ground. And so this park was somehow supposed to be this lush and green space in the centre of Glasgow, and actually just literally that under the surface was just rubbish, just bricks and stuff like that. So there was hardly any soil. So it was a horrible park. So it was part of a slightly ill thought through urban regeneration in the 60s and 70s in Glasgow anyway, when it was high rise living was the future, and the Stone Circle was part of that, but was completely unsustainable because there was never any plan to how to manage it. It wasn't even finished, and in the end it became that thing that you're talking about. It became the plaything of mostly of the kind of affluent, or so it was a astronomers went there and took measurements and readings. People went there for like solstices, dressed up in capes and carried out pagan ceremonies, and I'm guessing they're probably from a certain demographic as well. And you know that, so the most, because there was no information, there was nothing telling people what this monument was about. Then, for most people, it just would have passed them by as to what it was all about, you know, and they may have thought, "Oh, is it art or something like that?" You know, and that you get similar responses to ruinous prehistoric monuments or to replica prehistoric monuments in other places in Scotland where the local people don't have a clue what it is. There's no information. There's never been any information for 20 years. They walk past it every day and then they assume it's a landscape installation, a landscape art installation, which means nothing to them. So you end up with these kind of slightly weird perspectives. So it was a stone circle that was, in its conception, was an interesting and had good motivations, but it ended up, it just was a bit ham-fisted in the way it was delivered. And then the funding was cut anyway under the Thatcher government. So any hope it had of becoming a sustainable educational resource was lost, and it became like a white elephant really. And in fact, at one point, apparently, it was literally painted white. The council tried to liven it up, and they painted all the stones white. But then the paint faded about 2 years later, and it was gone, and that was it. So it's crazy.
So now they've removed the stones and they've buried them.
They've been buried about 200 metres away from where they were erected, and they'll be reappearing again. I think in 2019 when Sighthill is reconstructed in a new form, in a new monument, which Duncan Loonan, the guy who built it in the first place, is designing. But I think, as far as I know, it's going to be like a labyrinth or a spiral or something like that. It's not going to be a circle this time.
It's interesting because, I mean, from what I was reading about it, it's maybe, I mean, interpreting from prehistory, maybe then stone circles and stone monuments, their importance was formally, you know, physically, but now this Sighthill stone circle, the importance seems to be politically, economically, socially. The stones themselves aren't actually all that important.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually and it's to the extent of the form of the monument doesn't actually really seem to matter that much anymore to Duncan either, and it's more about using those stones again, and it's been quite a political process, So and there's lots of drivers behind it, which are not the kind of things you associate with prehistory, as you say, about, you know, development pressures, money and economy, economic changes, political changes, just a whole range of different things that meant that the monument was getting kind of passed about from pillar to post. So it would have had a very different kind of life from prehistoric monuments, which tended to last longer. I mean, most stone circles that were built in the past are still here, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 years later. So it didn't survive very long. But it's kind of, in a way, if you imagine if you're building stone circles now in urban environments, it's probably the way it's going to go. They're going to be all these different kind of things acting upon them that wouldn't have happened in the past. You know, things like potentially vandalism, planning permissions and changes, and it's like a kind of bureaucratic world. So it's a bureaucracy of stone circles really, and it's a different world. But at the end of the day, what have you got? You've still got a circle of stones standing. So in some fundamentals, it's no different from prehistory, and it's still something that people react to in quite a visceral way, I think. And you know, there's a kind of almost a primal reaction that people have to these kind of spaces as being sacred or being weird and significant in some way, maybe not really knowing the details of it. So if you strip away all the other stuff, you've still created a stone circle, which is what interests me about it, because it's a stone circle in the same way as the Ring of Brodgar's a stone circle, but it just happens to be from a different place in time. But the circle of a stones is a powerful idea, and one that probably has a big future potential in terms of, you know, why not build more urban stone circles? Why not think about how we can use prehistoric monument forms within modern context to do interesting things with? You know, at Drumpelly Loch near Coat Bridge just now, they're building an Iron Age cranog structure, which is a children's plague park essentially. But they're also going to use it as a place to do like workshops with local kids on the Iron Age and things like that, and open up conversations. There was a cranog found in the loch in the 1920s or something. So you've got basically utilisation of a prehistoric monumental structure form in a modern context, you know, to help add value to the lives of local people. So, why not? Why not? If we're talking about going back to traditional craft, traditional skills, traditional food sources, and so on, why not start building these things again as well in the landscape? And why not make use of them and their interesting and weird and kind of surprising qualities to do interesting things with? So, I think there's actually potential for us to build more stone circles, build more prehistoric buildings and structures, and use them in really interesting ways.
But then if they get built in an urban environment, like everything else, it's got a 30, 20 or 10 year
well, that's
lifespan.
A problem. Yeah, that's a problem.
It.
You've got it's about sustainability. Yeah, and some of these buildings wouldn't have been built to last. We know that there's huge Neolithic halls were built just after 4000 BC in Scotland, enormous buildings, and they were burnt down after about 25, 30, 40 years or something like that. So they were quite durable structures because they were built with oak posts that diameter. They're massive structures, and those posts could stand for hundreds of years if they were not damaged in any way. But for whatever reason, they used the building for a generation or two, and then they burnt them down, possibly when someone significant died or something like that. So sometimes these buildings were quite temporal, and actually we're quite used to that now, because like things like wind farms, they're all legally get planning permission for 25 years, and then the turbines have to be removed or replaced. So actually we're in a cycle now where we're used to things going up and going back down quite quickly, sometimes related to quality as well, of course, because modern buildings aren't as good as old ones. But
wind farms are quite interesting because they're like quite. I sort of consider them modern day sort of Neolithic monuments, and that
they have that quality. Yeah,
they're very much like they work in. For me, anyway, they work in the environment, but they're also very different to the environment, and also because they move.
Yes,
that's something you don't. That's not something that. Trees sway in the wind, but they don't move on a rotational basis.
And that's one of the main reasons it's often used to argue against them by people who don't like them, not because of the structure, but because they're moving structures, and so they cause distractions and things like that. So, or else they've got flicker effects and stuff like that. They're like there's no doubt that there will be some wind turbines that will become archaeological sites that will become like preserved as examples of the first type. And they have that quality. If you see them on horizon lines and there's lines of them, and some people have likened them to standing stones in different ways. So I think they have got that kind of, they are kind of maybe the modern day equivalent, of these big visual focal points within society or within the landscape. And
also structures that work with the landscape as well.
Yeah, they do. Well,
they depend on the landscape.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that there's a sense of kind of harmony about that as well. But they're also enough out of place to be noticeable and to be, for people to turn and glance and see them in the corner of your eye. You can see them. So in the same way as maybe big standing stones were entirely natural, but yet also slightly weird and out of place and would draw people's attention. So they've got a similar quality, I think.
I just wanted to finish up on a couple of points about you personally. Sort of like what led you to get into your profession?
I didn't intend to become an archaeologist. It was never in my plan. When I came to university, I wanted to work with maps and make maps and things like that. That's what I was really interested in. But I quickly realised I didn't actually like geography that much at university level, and I really enjoyed archaeology, and I enjoyed prehistory in particular. And I enjoyed what I've talked about. I enjoyed the kind of the challenge of trying to make sense of things that are really difficult to understand, and I enjoyed the flexibility and within that, that there was no compunction to come up with a final answer that kind of solved a problem, but there was lots of ways you could explore that in different ways. So I kind of thought, well, surely is it possible to have a career just trying to understand stone circles, for instance? And I realised, well, there probably is if you can get into academia, which is quite difficult. So I did my degree and I did a PhD on Cursus monuments with the idea of hopefully getting an academic post. But I ended up working in the Royal Commission in Edinburgh, who were a government agency who just catalogue all the archaeological sites in Scotland, and I did that for a few years, and then a chance came with a job at Glasgow, which I unexpectedly got, and then that was like, so then I was able to kind of explore stuff in research context. So yes, I wanted to be an archaeologist more or less as soon as I started uni, after about 6 months. So probably, when I was about 18, 19, I decided that's what I wanted to do. But before that, it never crossed my mind to be an archaeologist. I mean, I only did the subject of archaeology because I knew someone I only did the subject because I knew someone who'd done the first year course and they said, "Oh, it's quite interesting, and you can have my books," kind of thing. And I thought, all right, okay, I'll do it as a third subject just to see what happens. So it was never my intention at all. But I changed very quickly to wanting to do it, which is what happens with a lot of our students. A lot of our students come to do other things, and then, quite quickly they change their degree program to do archaeology. So it was a kind of unexpected turn of events that I decided to come down this route. Really.
Why were you interested in maps to start with?
I'm
interested.
Yeah,
in maps.
I'm interested. Well, I'm interested in landscape. I'm interested in how landscapes have come to be as they are. So which I guess is a naturally archaeological way to look at the world, because I've always been interested in the way that things relate to each other, like infrastructure and things like that. So like old railway lines that aren't even there anymore, but you can still see them and things, and how they all come together. So I'm interested in the way the landscape holds together. But I'm interested in the symbology of maps and the look of them, and I like the very stylised depictions of the landscape, and the process of map making seemed to me really interesting, and just the idea of trying to depict it in this two-dimensional format. And I like looking at maps. I love maps, so it's kind of all those kind of things. I just vaguely thought, well, maybe I could make maps, maybe I could work for the Ordnance Survey or something like that, and it'd be really great to be involved in that kind of process. So that's what I thought back then, I love maps now, and I still get to use them and create my own maps and things like that. So it's even better. So, but also get to study the story behind the maps, and why are things where they are? Why is that town located where it is? Why is that road run where it is? And suddenly it starts to make sense when you have that understanding of the deep time that underlies it. Suddenly, there's a road junction there. Oh look, there's a stone circle there's a standing stone next to that road junction. So that's been an important point in the landscape for 5,000 years, and it starts to all make sense with maps, I think.
Interesting. It sounds like you're also quite interested in the impact that humanity has had on the landscape, by saying about train lines and elements that are on maps that are clearly not natural.
And actually, now when I think about it, I wasn't as interested in natural landscape formation processes like geomorphology and things like that. I mean, I did all that stuff like glaciation and all the stuff that I did at school and in first year in geography, and about landscape, coastal erosion, that kind of thing. So, but actually, I guess that's true. That actually, I was more interested in human geography and about the way that humans impacted on the landscape than about glaciers and stuff like that. So yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I mean, I wanted to go on and talk about like where you want your work to take you, but I think you've spoken about that already.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to take it to be doing things that I feel are valuable beyond the university context, because I could easily spend the rest of my career writing academic papers, excavating sites, teaching and all that kind of stuff, which is fine and it's got its place. But I feel as if there's a very narrow value to society for that, and actually it's not very good value for society, because even if I'm creating knowledge, it's the kind of knowledge that's quite difficult for people to access, or it's behind a paywall, or it's written in a certain jargon-filled way, or it's actually just not really that interesting for a lot of people, for most people. So I think in the future, probably in an academic context, or maybe not, then I want to do things that I feel as if have an impact on more people, whether that be creating resources for schools, or whether it be working with community groups to try and do something interesting with a bit of prehistory that's in and amongst or where they live. A few kind of more sustainable legacies of that are based on academic research, and my knowledge as an archaeologist. So I think it's about just trying to feel as if that I'm offering something more to society than just knowledge generation, because knowledge generation only takes you so far. What do you do with that knowledge? And I think it's making that step beyond that takes you a bit beyond an straight academic life. So that's where I see myself in the future, really, just doing more of that kind of stuff beyond the university sector, not being so obsessively focused with journal articles, conference papers, and the usual round of stuff that comes with being an academic.
That's interesting, and that feeds into a lot of what you're saying. It's like, as archaeologists, you can acquire all this information, all this data of past, but then if it's just amongst academics and historians and archaeologists, then
because it's fine. I mean, you can dig a Neolithic site and then you can tell Neolithic scholars about it, and you can write some academic papers, but really that's quite a narrow win. There's not many people benefiting from that. And if that, and in particular, if that research is funded research, and there's public money involved and things like that, then you start to think, well, what's the taxpayer getting out of this really? Not a lot really. It's fine for my career, it's all going well for me, but I think that, but actually, that's not enough. I don't think it's not enough, and I think academics have to do more to justify our existence, to show why the academic research and the knowledge we generate is a value to society. Because the stuff we do is really important within an arts context in general. It's all really important stuff, but we're not always very good at making it clear what's important about what we do and why it matters to people. And if you just stay within your academic bubble all the time, then that's never going to change.
All right. Well, I think I've had you
down chatting for
now. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. It was interesting.